Okay, welcome back from the break. I hope you're all feeling enthused for the last few things. Did anyone, thanks Val, it's good to see a few faces in the Zoom. Not everyone has their camera on. Yeah, so did anyone come up with some examples they want to talk through as to how we can, yes, Dana? Was that a yes? No. Or did anyone have an example where something had gone wrong and they wanted to talk about how you can bypass that with the questions you ask?
Shishing put something in Slack, so might you want to.
Okay, thank you for reminding me. That's a really good point, She. Sometimes the way you convince people to do a new stats method is not by convincing them that it's a good thing to do conceptually, but just making it easy. Teaching them, like I find that new software, the JASP software, sometimes people say it's just another stats package. Others say it means Jeffrey's statistical package, but it has Bayesian and frequentist analyses side by side with diagrams, and it's curated, so it's not like SPSS, it doesn't provide everything, but it gives a very short, succinct sort of visual output, which has convinced a number of people to uptake Bayesian hypothesis tests who would never do it otherwise. And Dana said analyses that keep coming back. Yes, it's good to have repeat business. Is that what you mean by that? Where people come back because they like the advice you're giving?
No, that's not what I meant, but that is nice. No, I was meaning I've done some analysis and you send it off, you've written the report, and then they say, oh, actually, we've got more questions, or we found an error in the data, or we've actually got another 16 people, or and then if I haven't clearly defined the scope of the work, I find it very difficult to say, no, I'm not doing any more. And it really eats into your time when you've planned your next set.
Yes, and I think that's really to be addressed in the second workshop when you have a specific problem you're working on, negotiating what happens when they come back to you with just another little redo of the analysis. Exactly. Yes, that's a very difficult thing to negotiate. So I'll put it on the definites for the next session. Redos. These days, there's a greater expectation for reproducibility, so that can be big help, or writing notebooks where the analysis is automatically rerun, but that doesn't work when you have an iterative modelling kind of thing where the next analysis depends on the output from the previous one. So it really depends on the context. Okay, well, thank you for that. We've only got 1, 2, 3 more topics to go through, and they each don't have very many questions. So in an organisational context, there can be an expectation by some people that the stats advisor is the statistical slave. So I have been referred to as the pet statistician by some people who are transmitting an idea that the statistician sits there in the background like hidden figures and does the work that's needed in the background, but they're not brought to the foreground. They're not acknowledged as being a key person in the team. So how do you offset that kind of culture? I won't go through this because we're running out of time, but you might brainstorm any ways that funding sources have affected your advice, and you wish you'd asked a question up front. So it's very important in a university or an organisation to understand whether the project has been funded within the organisation, so you have in-kind allocation of people to the project, or externally, in which case you have a budget already set up, and then the question is, Am I being involved in the initial planning so we can build in the stats advice, or are you coming to us after the fact and there's no budget for statistical advice? They're two very different situations and you need to address those differently. So you need to have that question up front in the documentation for a project, but it can come to, as it relates to a person that you're working with, to know whether their position has been funded externally or internally is really important. So I will just clarify that's of the person, because we're only talking about the person at the moment that you're working for or working with rather than the actual project. And this has to do with when it's internal or external, that affects how reproducible or transparent everything has to be to different audiences, what the expectations are, and how easy it is to get additional support, such as a research assistant who's dedicated to the project, when it's difficult as a stats advisor working across many different people to provide that dedicated in-time support. It's very important from the technical side, whether they have someone on hand who, for instance, understands R or Python or the stats package. So have peer group around them that can help make your job easier. Or if you help them develop that peer group by putting them in touch with people, or as I do, exploit your training networks and create training opportunities when you have a number of people all working on similar things. And so understanding this or developing it for people will tailor the advice you provide. If they don't have a peer network in R, is R such a good thing to get them to use? It depends on their level of motivation. And I think this goes back to the question we had about redoing an analysis again and again and again. I've had students who learnt R and were able to tweak my code and repeat the code every time the data changed. And that meant I didn't have to do that. So I developed code that ran the first time and I tweaked it whenever it needed to be generalized enough to deal with a new situation, but they were responsible for rerunning it. And so it's how you design that workload that can really have a benefit up front. And sometimes, you know, they didn't allocate funding at first, but if you can sell it to them as to what can be achieved, you know, here's an out-of-the-box solution that gives you this much, but here's a much more tailored situation where you have more time involved, which will give you much better outcome. This is very important and perhaps belongs near the referral pathway. It's who they've already consulted with and what advice they were given. So sometimes I actually have to talk to the person they've consulted with to get their version of the advice provided. Because, you know, as you can imagine, someone who's receiving stats advice for the first time doesn't always interpret it the way that a statistical person would. And so you sometimes actually have to go and talk to the original advisor to find out. You don't want to be going over the same ground, or you can learn from what has happened in the past. And we've had some situations where people were shopping around, and in shopping around, they were trying to get very fast advice and jump the queue. So it's very important to keep your networks open so that you keep people abreast of whether someone's seeing multiple people. And as I said before, you need to be consistent, you know, professional courtesy. You don't want to denigrate the person who's already given advice. You build on the advice given. Think of a positive framing for it. Any questions about that? I think it's sort of come out of a lot of the things that have been brought up already. Now, this is something that a lot of people have mentioned, but I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle. I'm not trying to solve the problem at all at this stage in the first meeting. Instead, what I'm trying to judge is how well the person what stage the research is. Can they specify what the problem is, or are they a very early stage, or are they well, you know, they've already had several studies beforehand to find the problem, or are they in a very pioneering research context where they're still defining what the problem is. And the other reason is that, you know, people will send you a written document of what the project is purporting to do, but when they verbally talk to you, then they may give you a different picture. So what's on paper for the funding agency sounds good because they want to get the money, but what they actually tell you when they're talking face to face could be give you a very different angle on what they're actually aiming to do. So what I always ask for as a measure of preparedness is a written description, 1 or 2 pages of the project, written for a non-expert. So they can't write it for their supervisor or themselves. It has to be for someone like me who knows nothing about their research area. And it needs to really emphasize the data and analysis needs. And this simple request is not being used by me in the first meeting to try and problem solve. It's doing all these other things. It's contextualizing their research problem and providing you that big picture so you know whether they've actually settled on a statistical technique. So this often happens. Someone says, oh, I need advice on so-and-so's really advanced null hypothesis test of blah, blah in blah, blah situation. And I'll be like, oh, I haven't used that before, but do you really need it? I need to know the big picture before I can even begin to look up a technique that I'm not familiar with, or I may know under a different name. And so asking the right question is really half the problem for an advisor, making sure they're not accidentally leading you up the garden path, sending you off after a red herring. You need to know the bigger problem in order to make sure they're asking for the right kind of statistical advice. So you don't want to put a lot of time into solving the wrong problem, or indeed before the data is ready to be analysed. And you need to be able to manage your advice to what is achievable and within boundaries, whatever boundaries there are. And so this big picture helps you understand all that. And making, it's often overlooked and not unpacked. But I find it's very important for understanding how mature they are in defining their research problem. So sometimes they're trying to address the statistics before they're ready. And in that case, you would send them off to do more literature review and give them guidance on what to read and what to look out for in that literature review. Okay. So one thing you might want to reflect on is what can you gain from someone telling you about their problem, which isn't about the problem itself. Okay, so I touched on a few of those things, but what I think you might reflect on is a few conversations you might have had where listening to someone tell you about their problem actually told you much more than just the problem itself.
So I'm not sure if you want to look at Slack. There are a few comments there as well.
Cool, thank you. Yes, Berwyn's in a situation where it's very black and white, whether they can engage with people with a question. I am in a situation where I can give free advice of a certain amount across the board, but I have to be seen to be helping people across the board. And so this is where you end up being strategic as to whether you engage with a whole group of people with the same kind of question, you deliver a training course to meet a fundamental need to a large number of people, or you might take a risk and give some free advice in case it turns into something bigger and more very useful and get funded. Yes, that's a good comment, Angela, that people use syntax so it's reproducible. Excellent. Okay, so the final topic here, and this is something I've only been doing, I guess, since I've been at Griffith. I find that with preparation, in addition to filling out this questionnaire before someone comes to speak to us, there's one thing that I ask people to prepare, which tells me a whole lot about how things might go. So I was just interested to start with, if you could put into Slack, if you could ask people to do one thing to prepare for your first stats advising session. You've asked them to fill out all those questions so you know who they are, where they come from, what their background is, who else is on their team, what their funding is. What else would you do to get them to prepare before they come to your first session? And I can share you with one trick that I use, but other people might have very good tricks as well. Well, a few people typing, which is encouraging. Oh, I didn't scroll down, so I didn't see. Yes, what is your research question? So that's more about the next questionnaire, which is about a new research problem. What is your research question? Which is similar to this synopsis of their research problem that I was just talking about. Summarize a previous study that you hope to follow on or build upon. So Xiqing, that's actually what I do. That is the trick that I do use. So what I do is I get them, I find it's a very visible thing. And through this very concrete thing where they find one previous study, I can learn about many other things. So it's a very useful technique. I use it to find out the types of stats method that they're envisioning. So if they can provide a key paper in their field or a related field, if there is nothing like it in their field, which analyzes similar data, and either they would like to emulate the approach in that paper, or they might even want to improve on the approach in the paper, or perhaps the paper has described the problem well and highlighted issues relevant to their problem. So if they can come to the first meeting having found at least one paper, maybe 2 or 3, mostly it's just one key paper, I find it's essential for understanding where they're coming from. It's also really indicative of how, what sort of skills they have in researching. So a lot of PhD students, when it comes to methodology, may say, I'm using this method because my supervisor said so, or someone told me to. So if you can get them to bring one key paper, that means they've had to go off and either hammer their supervisor to get a more concrete evidence of why they should be using a particular technique, but hopefully they've gone off and researched based on the hint that their supervisor has given them to find some evidence for how that method has been used in their field. It shows a desire to learn. So I've found that in the past, when people don't do this, then they're not really open. They're more of the people who want to outsource their statistical advice. They're not really the people who want to be involved in the statistical advising. They're more looking for a statistical consulting outsourcing arrangement. So this is very useful for finding out the kind of person you're dealing with and what their expectations are in terms of your relationship, whether they will do one thing that you ask or not. And so it helps me also to quickly get a handle on the language, the statistical terminology. So random effects models are also called hierarchical models, mixed effects models, all sorts of things. There's so many different terms for the same model, and it varies across fields. So if you can get one paper in a related field, that helps you know which set of terminology to use with your new client. Should you be talking about dependent variables why variable, response variable. There's so many terms. So you need to know about the language, other conventions of how that model is used in that field. We'll know regression is used differently across all fields. And then, you know, more complicated models, of course, are used differently. What sort of context they're working in, what are the key questions, what have people already done, and what are people really struggling with in their field. So this is the one thing that I've found has really helped make my advice a lot more efficient. And I can learn a lot more about the person by giving them one job to do before they come to their first session, in addition to filling out the form. So is there anyone else who's come up with a different, I'm not sure if that's what you were thinking, Xi-Ching, or if anyone else has used that trick and found it useful or not?
Yeah, I found it useful, not so much to gauge the person themselves and how willing they are to learn, but just to get my head around the conventions and the terminology, like you say.
Yeah, yes. But I do think that as you are working with people, sometimes there are many different ways to analyze the same data, the same research question. It also helps to understand what sort of effort they're willing to put in, or what literature they're able to read and gain something from. So it can be very helpful to see where their mind is. Good point. Okay, so we've come towards the end, just in time. So a few last words. You know, I've used, in constructing this questionnaire, it's not comprehensive. Its intention is, it's structured so that first time people, because everyone has to fill out this form online, it means that any of the research methods advisors who are just starting out have this very structured format of information. They don't have to remember things. But because I'm quite, well, I consider myself experienced, but every now and then I forget stuff, and I might not ask a question that would have offset a problem later on, and I wished I had. I can use this as a checklist after the first meeting to make sure I covered all my bases. I might do a more unstructured way of interviewing and rely on my memory so that I maintain that conversational flow. But people with less experience may prefer a semi-structured approach where they don't talk through the questions one by one. They more or less follow it and then check some of them after the fact. In terms of coverage, I've tried to include the essential questions, and there's some glue in there to help with the conversational flow, the transition between topics. Sometimes there are multiple questions on one thing to help you get at, you know, who they are and what sort of team they're working in. Other times, like the latter questions on this questionnaire, are merely starters trying to set the scene for moving into actually finding out about their problem. There's a rhythm to this interview set of questions. We ended with the more difficult questions. I always put in my email to first timers, please do that last thing, find me a paper that inspires you. You want to emulate it or you want to improve on it. I always put that in the email, because if they don't go all the way through the online form, I still want them to do that before they meet with me. And you've got to adapt to this tone, which depends on who you're talking to as to whether they want a more unofficial, you know, a relaxed kind of conversational tone or a very formal corporate one. If they're just wanting a brief chat with you, one-off, you might do an abbreviated form of this and then talk about a specific problem that they're having, but you still need some background before you give some feedback, or whether they're trying to develop potential for an ongoing collaboration. So, you know, I haven't really covered any of those, the tone issues, but the design of the questions has been flexible in terms of delivery. It's a bit of a balance, and you can adapt this to be more or less specific or general, depending on your work environment. And there's a bit of a rhythm, so think about where you insert new questions. And I'd just like to finish by saying that it takes time to develop statistical advising skills and also to develop that experience with solving, you know, different, how you match that statistical method to the research problem. And that's one of the, you know, things I really enjoy is the problem solving aspects of statistical advising. There's no two problems are the same. And there's always more than one, you know, probably many different appropriate methods that are appropriate and many different ways of doing your advising. And you should, you know, develop a method that's natural to you, tailor the methods and your advising style to the client and to yourself. So this is just a starting point, some things to think about. And I'll talk to Daniela about the possibility of a second workshop. So please let us know if you're interested. And then in terms of the Slack, because Stats Society has provided it, they will deliver the slides. Please feel free to keep adding to the discussion. We could have a round table where people might share resources like papers or websites, and then people could, you know, make comments on those. Just, yes, I found that useful, or no, I didn't. I found this more useful for this reason. And then if anyone wants to suggest something else that we should include or could think of including in a questionnaire that's specific to their work environment, please feel free to contribute. So thank you very much. And I'll hang around for questions. We've got a break coming up, don't we, Daniela?
No, we have plenty of time if you want.
Okay.
We have like 26 minutes by the schedule. So if people have questions.
I'll have a look at Slack. Oh, thanks for the really nice feedback. How to interact better with stats consultants. Ah, yes. You're welcome to ask a question that I might not have covered or suggest something that I didn't think of.
Shishing has his hand up.
Okay, Shishing. Yep.
Being on the committee, I feel like I've got to get the question time going. I just wanted to clarify something you said toward the end there. It might just be a terminology. The difference between a statistical advisor and a statistical consultant, did you say sort of the latter is more someone who is paid to sort of take on the whole task of statistical work, whereas the advisor is just as a guide? Is that kind of what you meant?
Yeah, I do distinguish the two roles in my mind. I'm not sure about whether everyone else shares that terminology, so that's a really good question, Shishing. I see advising as where you're giving advice on how to progress, but you're not necessarily involved in doing that progression. Consulting, on the other hand, is where, you know, I've been involved in Stats Consulting Unit, where we took jobs from internally or externally and we did the work. So you're more operating like almost a software engineer. You're finding out what the specifications are for the job. So I had initial training in software engineering, which is why I'm talking about it this way. But you get the specifications of what is required, you get all the data, you analyze it, and you provide a report back. Usually it's good to have technical reports in case they need to cite that. But consulting is more where you're doing the work. Now, if you're advising, you will handhold enough to get that person up from the baby steps to the next level. And this is where the art is of not advising them to do something that's too difficult and out of their reach. It has to be something in their reach, within their skill set and their peer support and their resourcing that's available. So sometimes I'm in a situation where we have both going on, So I will be doing advising, and they'll put on someone to do the work, a research assistant or a consultant. And then I work in between as making sure if they've got an early career researcher who's very good at doing a well-defined problem, but might not be aware of all the statistical methods available, or the whole way that you can, how far you can push a technique, what you can get out of it. And so I just still might stay along for the ride as an advisor. So, and sometimes I write code to just get them started, and then they adjust it. So it's, yeah, it's always a balance, but I do distinguish the two roles, because in our, we have a web page, which defines what our role is at the university, and it's not to do the work, it's to advise. So we've had to be very careful about that, just how to delineate the two. I don't know what other people's experience is with that.
Thank you. That's a good distinction.
Yeah. Yeah. So do you have to, have you had to make that distinction in your work, or do you tend to get one type of thing or the other?
I haven't had I've been, when I was helping with PhD students, it's very clear that they need to take ownership. So it's really about, in fact, it's more like an educator. You're teaching them rather than you can't do the analysis for them, because it's obviously their research.
Yeah.
Now I'm less of that, and now actually being the consultant and actually doing analysis. Then people, all they want is a slide deck at the end with results, if you like.
Yeah. I found that can be difficult when you're just, it's just a tick at the end with the report. And so it's a very different set of concerns that you have in passing the finish line with a stats consulting job, as opposed to teaching, yes, or advising. A few reports I've done where, they just have to say, yes, we've done it. And then, no, we don't have to do anything with it, but yes, we've done it.
Kylie has also shared something in Slack in regards to that.
That's an interesting comment, Kylie. When you say the same role, do you mean the same job description? Can do and consulting?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of. So, I'm located within one particular research team, and so for projects that clearly come under that, their umbrella, then it may be full consulting, and then stuff that comes in from outside, it might depend on whether they have collaborations with my chief investigators or whether there's funding to support it. Otherwise, it's strictly kind of an advising, type job. So they all kind of get assessed one-on-one, and, depends on a lot of those factors as to, I think it's kind of a sliding scale as well. There's a lot of grey in between of where the line falls between advice and doing. And sometimes it's a bit of walking a tightrope to work out exactly where a particular project should fit.
Absolutely. And I think that when you're working with people who accept that there's an iterative approach to doing statistics, you do have to get them started. And so you do, but then they also take on big ownership, as Shi Ching was saying, in running it through and doing all the checks, running it through different scenarios. But
yeah, absolutely.
It's very grey. Therein lies the challenge. But yeah, I know what you mean when you say you're doing a favour for someone, your boss or something. I try to, I have a strategic basket. So there are jobs which are strategic in order to satisfy the boss or to establish new partnerships. And so there's some risk associated with them. You don't get the same sort of payback on it necessarily, but it's always good to do a few slightly risky things. You just so that you broaden your horizons and you don't just, stick to the same thing. So some really good jobs, and, my postdoc and my PhD arose out of those risky kinds of things that we didn't think would have a payoff. It's good. And then Angela's got a good point there. You find that you're doing mostly the consulting side because they're too busy? Don't have the headspace, Angela? Is that part of the problem?
With clinicians,
Yes.
no, they don't have the ability actually. They quite happy to admit that too. So in fact, it makes my job a lot easier. You know, they come in, just say, look, you know, I have to spend quite a bit of time with them because obviously I need to get them to explain the context and everything, which is a bit more tricky. But
Yeah.
you know, they trust me to do it, and they trust themselves in that they just cannot do it. So beyond Excel, so that's quite nice, really. It's a bit grayer in a university context, I find, because you theoretically are supposed to be advising students on how they are supposed to be doing their own analysis, and often you end up doing most of it anyway. But it just takes a lot more time and hand holding and whatnot. So there's, yeah, that element of advising, and some of them will go off and just do it, which is good, the good ones. But yeah, often you find that you kind of end up doing it. So there's a bit more negotiation around all that.
Yeah, well, actually, that does, you know, sometimes I end up doing, you know, new novel statistics, and then I write up a paper with me as the first author, or the, you know, another PhD student who's a statistical or data science student will write that first author that paper, and the area, the researcher with the problem, with the question, is the second author. And with a PhD student at our university, they're allowed to have a paper, if they're submitting by papers, they're allowed to have a chapter where they're not the first author, but they've had a major contribution. So if they're the second author, it still satisfies that. But this way you're acknowledging that they couldn't do the technical stuff, and it would be wrong to expect a student who's not a statistician to invent or create a new methodology, statistical methodology, a new model, or you know, tailor the computation so they can fit this model. So that way we end up sometimes with two papers, one on the methodology and one on the findings from using that methodology. And you often have to write about the methodology first in order to get the findings published. So you end up, sometimes you can get through with, depending on how you present it, as already established, but there's potential for you then to write up the methodology after the fact as well. But yeah, that definitely falls into that grey area, but it's all about acknowledging what their limitations are on their skills, and whether you have the time to do something strategic. Because my role has 40% research, I can do those sorts of things, but other people who are on pure teaching or advising roles do not have that kind of capacity. So it's a tricky area.
Chris also has his hand raised. If you want to turn on your mic.
Hello. To have another question. I know you mentioned this at the start and towards the end of the workshop, but with the idea that you can, with advising, there's a lot of solutions you can have and a lot of ways you can advise. Like, how would we know, like, that the solution that we come up with is a good fit to solving the problem that the client has?
So first of all, it needs to tick the boxes that the client, you know, the constraints, the problem, does it answer their question, blah, blah, blah. But outside of that, as you're developing your skills as a stats advisor, it's very helpful to have a mentor, someone you can bounce ideas with. So when I was in a stats consulting unit early in my career, before, during and after my PhD, we had a professor and several who was responsible for the stats consulting unit. They really weren't that familiar with the business of consulting. So a lot of the reason I learned about the risks and managing risks by asking questions, that sort of thing wasn't really in their experience, but what was in their experience was the technical side of how do you answer the questions and keeping it real. So coming up with a feasible solution in the time available. And so I think mentors are really important for helping you learn that art of matching the solution to the problem, because there are so many options. To some degree, you can refine down the options by talking to the client, but I often, you know, if I'm mentoring, I sit in on some of the meetings with the client and the stats advisor, or the research methods advisor who's learning the trade. And, you know, I read some books when I was younger, just starting out to be a stats consultant. There's some good books in the library on statistical consulting. And they really helped me develop those skills. Reading journals on the applied statistics end of the spectrum, so things like significance, are really good at developing your general knowledge of statistics. So if you're going to become a statistical advisor, and if you're like me and you love knowing about a range of different techniques, then you're not a specialist, you're almost a GP of statistics. You may have some specialties, but you may be more interested than your computational statistician, for instance, in understanding that wider view of a range of statistical approaches. And there's so many that, you know, even in my lifetime, I'm only able to get my head around a few of them, but at least I've got a fairly diverse range of things. But, you know, another statistician will develop a different set of expertises, depending on the problems they encounter, you know, early and later on in their career, they'll have different skills. So having a mentor and a peer group of stats consultants and advisors. So the Stats Society, I think, has put in place some initiatives over the past couple of years, which are really helpful in supporting early career stats advisors and consultants. They actually have the Stats Consulting Network. They have this early career, I can never remember the acronym, Early Career Statisticians and Students Network. They also have a mentor-mentee program. So watch for the call out early in the new year for people who want to nominate as a mentee, someone who wants to be mentored. And I wish I'd been able to take advantage of that when I went to work in the EPA, and I was the only statistician there. So I often felt bad by annoying people who weren't in my work environment. They had to kind of invest a bit of time to really understand the problem. So, and I was on my own at that stage. So it would have been good to have a mentee perhaps in the Stats Society, but I did really benefit from the society at that stage. They supported me to go to conferences. As an industry person, I got invited to give talks by people I had known. And so I was getting some level of mentoring through those kinds of activities. So keeping your networks outside your organization, across your profession, is really helpful in helping you develop that. Yeah. And, you know, I even get people to peer review decisions. So I might, in a project, I will put time aside. And if I have funding available, I will put time in the project for someone to review what I've done. So I don't put all the onus on myself. It's very important just with the stats methods to sometimes get that high level commitment to validating the approach, the choice of the approach. Yeah. And you know, people will always come up with something helpful that you haven't thought of, because we're all human. So does that answer your question, Chris?
That answers it more than I thought it would. So thank you very much.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. So, I mean, that's a good thing that I didn't put a slide in. I should have put a slide in, Daniela, in future on the mentor-mentee program and the Stats Consulting Network. And we now, through your membership to the Stats Society, you do get the journal, is it Significance?
Yeah.
For free, because we've got this relationship now for just it just happened last year. So you get that subscription to Significance for free.
Yes, and the mentoring program is open now, so people can put in their applications, and we have a session tomorrow morning talking about that. So Lisa and Nicole White will be talking about more details on that, so people can apply for it and start in the new year. So that's really good.
Oh, that's good to know. I didn't realize it was tomorrow.
Yes, and Xing had put some information as well in the Slack, and Kyle has also put in a paper on statistical advising as well in the Statistics in Medicine journal, if people want to get out.
Yeah, so I do try to encourage the research methods advisors who are just starting out to develop networks of peer review where you write something, you send it to a friend, critical friend, they write something, they send it back, but you're not actually working in the same business unit. You're just becoming critical friends so that someone who understands method is reading it through and checking you haven't said anything accidentally weird, or that it makes sense to someone who's not right there in the problem, taking the jargon, you know, picking up some jargon and things. So I have found that some people found that very difficult. They don't like to ask for help, but if you can develop that peer mentoring, peer network of critical friends who are like you, they're just starting out or slightly more experienced, it really can help. You don't just rely on that mentor then, but people at level.
Yes, and we have to implement these types of things in the network as well. So feel free to, if we're open to that, we have the Slack open as well for 3 months. So if people want to start collaborating, there's space that we can start that going.
Yeah, so maybe drop a line into the chat here for the Slack site if you'd like to find people who want a critical friend willing to review things.
That's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, we still have 6 more minutes. We could finish earlier, or we can have more questions if people have more questions. Thank you so much, Summer. That was very helpful, I think, for everyone. And we definitely will schedule the second round of it.
Yeah, and I'm very interested in any feedback you have. If you can think of any other question that you think would be useful to put in that first meeting or preparing for the first meeting, please feel free to jot it down, because I might have left out something that I always do but don't ask, or something I've never thought of.
Xing, do you want to?
Yeah, I have just another question. So I'm thinking of students who come through their university studies, they're studying statistics, they perhaps haven't necessarily considered statistical consulting as a career. And I know that some universities have a unit called statistical consulting or advising, but how do you think this sort of education be put into a university course, even not overtly, but as part of training?
It's a hard thing, isn't it? Like when I was working in the EPA, there were biometricians who had come through training in experimental design and linear models. And it was a recognized role in government in the DPIs, so the Departments of Primary Industries and other areas of government. So there are some areas of government where there is an expectation that people have those skills, but I think what's happened is that there are now many more paradigms available. So statistics is seen to be competing with data science, which in some ways includes statistics or sometimes sits beside it. Depends how you're looking at data science. So Noel Cressy's actually written really nice commentary on that. How you see data science and statistics, or call it data engineering and data analysis, the two different approaches. And so if you're trying to prepare a young person for looking at what sort of job options they might open up, they probably have many more options in industry if they follow that data science path. And then the statistical side is more of a specialty, you know. So they've just revisited the international curriculum for teaching data science, and statistics is in as the final thing. And it's to make sure you don't get things wrong. I can't remember the terminology, but it's like a, you know, clarifying uncertainty, and that's been interpreted to, you know, validating things and making sure and quantifying risk, I guess, which is an interesting way to present statistics, because when I'm working with these more qualitatively minded researchers, that's not how they're thinking at all. It's statistical modelling is more about allowing them to present the logic of their research question and guide how they investigate what the variables are and their relationships. So it's not at all anything to do with uncertainty. So there's different ways, but I do think that if I'm honest, I think that in the future there's a lot of work to be done with the statistical profession as building that capability for people who have statistical understandings which are not taught in data science to be valued as a different, you know, having a different skill set there. So yet being attractive to employers. So I think you'll be very attractive to employers if you have that data science background, but then you have an added benefit. You have the logic of, there's a causality science. So there's a nice book of Why by Judea Pearl on just, you know, structural equation models and Bayesian networks. It's causal diagrams and guiding how you answer research questions in that kind of, you know, conceptually how you organize things. And a lot of social and behavioral and scientists and participatory research and a whole area of people really benefit from that approach to things. And I don't think that's how data scientists are really trained. And then you've got the whole area of designing experiments and doing model checking and managing the risk of doing any sort of statistical modeling. And so, yeah, if you can think of ways of promoting those two aspects as a specialty that you have to add to the data science, I think that's a benefit. But I think as a profession, and that's one reason why I actually joined the Stats Society, I'm very concerned about in the next 10 years how we manage that transition for the younger people, the longevity of our profession.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shishing. We have one more comment from Angela, but if you want to address it.
Yeah, do you want to expand on that, Angela?
I probably can't expand too much, but just in my experience, as a biostatistician who originally came from a mathematical background, I have encountered problems, I suppose, where, especially when you're working in medical statistics, I guess there's a lot of very, you really need to get your head around the kind of art of it as well as the mathematical side of it. And sometimes, and I think a lot of this comes with experience as well, but you know, sometimes you get given something that's already been tackled by, and I'll just preface this by saying stuff, don't kill me now when I say this, a mathematical statistician versus a biostatistician. And it's not that it's just that the context, how you look at things needs to be quite specific. And I think a mathematical statistician will look at things could look at certain problems in a different way. And so I would say that often a biostatistician wouldn't be able to tackle a problem that a mathematical statistician, and vice versa. And that's what I'm trying to say there is the types of problems that are looked at. Whereas from the outside, people go, oh, statistician, and once their eyes have stopped rolling into the back of their heads, they'll kind of go, oh, can you, look at this? And then wonder why the paper doesn't get published. And you know, they're all very specialist fields, and I think statistics is, data science is sexy at the moment, where statistics is, not sexy. Well, for people looking on from the outside, people who are in the know and need us, think we're very sexy, but well, maybe not. Maybe I won't go. Maybe not quite that far, but
I know what you mean. I think it's that quote about that.
Yeah, and it is. So your point of it's kind of a bit of a PR exercise almost, and also just that we're not the tail end that comes in to mop up, what they've done in Excel, or whatever it is, and I think that's becoming a bit more accepted now that statisticians are an important part of the team, and you need to be part of that team from the get-go, not just the person who pushes a few buttons at the end. But that's come with a lot of pushing and a lot of work from a lot of us, I think, to really kind of emphasize that, no, you have to, we have to be on your paper. And so they go, oh, well, you have to do a bit more. And I said, well, exactly, because we're going to do a bit more anyway. So why don't we start at the beginning?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think you've touched on some very important issues there. And that, that how statisticians are acknowledged and brought in from the beginning, but sometimes a new relationship starts when they come to you at the end and they didn't realize.
Yeah.
So where, it's part of that, having, like you say, having that long view of how you can be involved in the longer term with people, and changing a research culture where they only expect you to do things the last minute.
And I think sorry.
Sorry, it's just because we are up to time for the next session, but that's a great discussion, and I encourage us to continue on Slack as well, that discussion. That would be great. I'm sorry to interrupt that thought. It's just that we need to go to a different Slack for the session now, and some people might just come for the afternoon session, not for the morning one.
You want to just remind people what's on next so they go to the right session?
Yes, so we just have one session, but we have a different Slack link, which should be in the main
hall.
It's going to be a new Zoom link that will be put in the main hall as soon as we're done with this.
Okay.
Yeah, so it should be in the main hall sometime. Is already there, Jody, the new one? Not yet.
It's being put up right now.
Great, thank you.
Okay, is it there? Yeah, so if we could all, perhaps we'll allow like a 2-minute break or so, but then we will join to the next session. Thank you so much, Sama. It was great, and it was a great discussion. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, please join me and thanks, Sama. And yeah, it's a great discussion, and I encourage everyone to keep the discussion going on Slack and keep the momentum. Thank you so much.
Yep.
See you all very soon in the other Zoom.
It's wonderful.